The red button is pressed. We are on the record. It is another day in the life of being a demon from outer space. Episode. I think I've lost track of the episode numbers. D. Is it like 131, something like that? It's been
Shit. Hold on.
It's been a uppity downity couple of weeks, and I've lost track of the consistent editing and keeping track of the numbers, so I have no fucking idea. But Dylan McCandless, Super DM 64, he's here. He's more with it and together than me, which is a scary comparison.
I don't know if that's true, but yeah, this is episode 131.
Well, I guess I'm pretty together on that side of it, so thank God for that. That's one concrete fact I can lay down about myself. I can feel secure about that.
I'd like to say off the bat that both me and Bill are sick. So if there's any like weird voice things, that's probably why.
Or if one of us just or like both of us either start sneezing or hacking up along in the middle of the podcast, that's why.
Yeah, well, I
it's
usually
not because we're transforming into an alien life form copy of ourselves.
No. I usually mute my mic if I feel one of those coming on anyway. So
well, it's very polite of you. I usually don't give a fuck.
No, but this is technically the Thanksgiving episode of the Demons from Outer Space.
Not by any like specific choice. We just kind of happen to pick this review topic, and then we're like, "Oh, it's a Thanksgiving episode."
Yeah. This is Thanksgiving week, everybody. So usually,
aren't you excited?
Usually on Thanksgiving weeks, we have used the thematic connection of the giant claw to tie into the whole turkey idea. This year, we're going with another Thanksgiving theme: the inability to recognize your family members. As we
That's
discuss
a beautiful one.
As we discuss
one that I can sympathize with and aspire to.
Yeah, you know when you go to Thanksgiving dinner and you find out that your uncle voted for Trump and you're like, is he a pod person? So yeah, we're going to be talking about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. We're going to talk about the 50s version and the 70s version. We're not going to talk about the 90s version or the Nicole Kidman one. Because
that's four movies then, and it's already going to be a long process to dissect these two, so we don't need all that.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the original and the first remake, which is probably the best.
The best remake or the best version of this story in general?
Well, that is something that we can discuss because I chose this review topic, and one thing that I wanted to sort of open up with is to ask you which version you think is superior, and then we can, as we review the two, discuss why.
Right up front, I would have to say I prefer the original, largely because of pacing and I guess just efficiency of getting to the point of what it's all about. I feel like the 70s version is more expansive, and it arguably makes the point better in regards to what's going on here and what this thing's all about. And it's gorier and you see more detail, and that's all awesome. But it's longer, it's more drawn out. It's also darker than the original, I think. And I think that's a positive thing. However, I just think the original gets to the point better. It's more iconic, and the 50s commie kind of aspect of it works better in the original. In the 70s version, that's not so much at the forefront. It's sort of vaguely in there from the premise at the start. But
right,
they're more expansive about the alien life form itself, and there's one point where, I mean, we're not going to hold back on spoilers, right? I mean, these movies are mad old, but there's one point where Leonard Nimoy, having already been revealed as a pod person himself, is talking about like, oh, we travel from planet to planet, taking what we can and then moving on when we've depleted the resources. So you don't get anything like that in the original. There's no point where any pod person starts getting all speechy like that. It's all kind of vaguely implied based on what's going on.
Yeah.
But I think that's creepier, and I think that works better with the whole 50s paranoia, Red Scare kind of thing. which is what
Yeah,
it's really tapping into. How do you feel about it?
they they did weave some different social commentary into the '70s version that we can talk about when we get into specifics.
Yeah, well, I think it's different in a good in a good way. I just think the original gets to the point better. Again, I think just pacing is what it comes down to for me.
Yeah. It's very, very close, like incredibly close, like a micrometer apart. But I give a slight edge to the '70s version because I enjoy the expansion on the premise and sort of the way it, you called it more drawn out. I would say I would say it's more detailed. It's a
Sure.
better look at how the pod people work.
Mm-hmm.
I think the '50s version leaves you with some questions, and then there are still some questions at the end of the '70s one. But yeah, I like that aspect of it, and also it's wonderfully directed. There's such atmosphere in that movie, and it's very much in line with the other sort of remakes of '50s movies of around this time, the '70s and '80s. Your Flies and your The Things, and uh, this isn't a remake, but it's also kind of in line with Alien in that it's got that like horror science fiction element much more than the original movie did, and it's not only a good science fiction film, it's also a really good horror film. Uh, Also, you have a good performance from Leonard Nimoy and a very young Jeff Goldblum. But yeah, so there are just a few little things like that caused me to give a slight edge to the '70s version. But like you said, the '50s version is obviously way more iconic. Um,
Yeah, it's
so
dumber. It's dumber in some respects. Uh,
it is it
and
is
that
dumber.
and that's but that's also somewhat charming, and I kind of prefer the tone of all that, like the kind of cheesy '50s B movie tone, which it definitely has. The solution to every problem is to drink. Like that's the one thing that I watched the '50s version with my mom because I mentioned to her that we were going to review it, and she was like, "Oh, well, let me watch it with you," and I was like, "All right." So we're watching it, and I'm just like, every time they're presented with some kind of problem, the doctor is just like, have a drink, like here, have some whiskey, and I'm just like, that's the solution to every problem. And then eventually they run out of situations where that's even applicable, and then they're just being chased. But up to that point, the solution to every problem is to drink. Did you notice that?
Uh, yeah. Well, it's the '50s.
Yeah, well, that's what me and my mom were making fun of, is that everybody had a bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. That's just the way things were. If you were cold outside, you came in, you had a little bourbon, and that would warm you up. You had wine every night with dinner and after dinner. Had a nightcap, all that shit. Alcohol was a regular part of the schedule. Now
Yeah.
we binge drink at certain times. That's how we do it. It's a commitment. But back in the day, it was a little here and there.
Yeah. Uh, okay. So we've put on the table right from the start which ones we kind of give the edge to. But before we get into
Well,
specifics, though,
I'll give another edge to the '70s one on your side of it. The ending is superior. Another
oh,
part of the dumbness of the '50s version is that everything just kind of gets positively wrapped up at the end. Like
yep.
I thought I had predicted how it would kind of apocalyptically end, but it didn't, and it all
Well,
kind of has this uplifting ending. And I was like, oh, that's not really what you would expect or want with this kind of story.
there's a funny story about that. And this is actually a nice segue because before we get into the specifics of reviewing the movies, I wanted to list off some fun facts that I found while doing some research for this. But the story behind that is originally the movie was supposed to end with Kevin McCarthy's character running around on the highway begging people to stop. And he's like, please, you got to stop. And he's ranting and raving. That was supposed to be the end of the movie. And they screened it that way, and the studio, I guess, didn't like it because they wanted them to put a happy end. Not a happy ending. It's not, but they wanted them to throw some hope in at the end because it's the '50s, and so they went back in and they added the framing device. Like they shot the stuff with him in the police station at the beginning of the movie and at the end because the studio didn't like the way that the movie ended.
Yeah, no, it's way better, and the narration's also not great. That's another thing that makes it kind of very cheesy 50s. Without the narration, I feel like it would be 10 times better.
Yeah,
Uh,
I kind of like the narration just because it almost gives it a noir feel. It almost feels like a noir movie, but instead of a detective story, it's about a doctor uncovering like an alien. Well, I guess it is kind
it
of a detective.
plays as a small town mystery, which is nice.
Yeah,
Especially when the whole idea of a body turning up is introduced, and it's not a murder. And that's
yeah.
nice for this kind of thing because it's not about an alien creature going around killing people necessarily. Uh,
So, just some fun facts for the people listening. If you're not aware, the Invasion of the Body Snatchers is based on a 1954 novel by a man named Jack
that's a
Finney.
good year for anything.
It is. The novel is just called The Body Snatchers, and then the 56 film added The Invasion of to the title. Later remakes would play with the title a lot. The 90s version is just called Body Snatchers, and then the one with Nicole Kidman is just called The Invasion. It doesn't that version doesn't even have pods. It's just like an alien virus. But so the 56 movie takes place in a fictional town called Santa Mira, California. It's like a little small town America type deal. And that name has been reused in other things. So Santa Mira, California is also the name of the town that the Halloween masks come from in Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. And it's been
Oh,
in other
wow.
works. It's been in other works of fiction as well. You can Google Santa Mira, and you'll get like a whole Wikipedia article telling you all the different works of fiction that have used that name. At one point in the 56 film, there's a small role of like a meter maid. Like he comes into the basement, and Kevin McCarthy's super suspicious because they already know about the pod people at this point. And he's like, "Oh, I'm just reading your meter." That is actually Sam Peckinpah, who of course went on to become a very famous director. And he also did some work in this movie as like the dialogue, what do you call it? Dialogue supervisor, director, whatever. Um, the star of the 56 movie, Kevin McCarthy, and the director, Don Siegel, both have cameos in the 1978 version.
Yeah,
Did
that
you
was the
catch this?
big thing I noticed was the star of the original. He has a big cameo in the remake. I mean,
Yeah,
he gets like run over by a car at one point. So
that's a great cameo. Don Siegel actually plays the cab driver near the end of the movie.
oh, that's
That
also great.
Yeah. And then there's one more interesting cameo in the 78 version. At the beginning of the movie when the children are near the playground and there's that weird priest swinging on the swing set staring at them and he's clearly supposed to be a pod person?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, that is actually famed actor Robert Duvall.
Oh wow, I did notice that. I figured he was supposed to be somebody scoping out what was going on.
Yeah.
There's some. I also wanted to just throw this in there since we mentioned before in the kind of overview section. There's some dumb stuff in the 50s version. There's also some dumb stuff in the 70s version, but it's not as noticeable because, like you said, it has a harder edge to it, and it's more of a horror movie, and it kind of just has a part in all the weirdness of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the 70s version it feels much more intentional. It's very intentionally weird.
Yeah,
Whereas in the 50s,
especially with the main characters, because like the '50s version is very earnest. So like the main characters being kind of weird in their romance and in their interpersonal lives, it feels awkward. But in the '70s version, it feels like intentionally awkward and like they have real problems. But anyway, we can get into all that when we get into more detail. You got any more fun facts? Mr.
no,
Substitute Teacher, did you prepare anything else on your phone you're gonna read in front of the fourth graders while they all daydream about fucking the school nurse?
no.
Okay, good. Because they're all
I
done
for one
fantasizing now. They've all creamed their pants. It's disgusting out there. We should wrap up class.
I for one had a disgusting school nurse.
I didn't have a very attractive one either, but that's one of the basic like porn fantasies out there that has like a catalog of movies based on it that I could think of. So that's what I came up with. But anyway, regardless of that,
I couldn't even do like the Animaniacs thing, whistle and go, "Hello, nurse."
no, definitely not. You would also probably get in trouble, so you wouldn't even try it.
Probably.
Um, especially if she was a pod person, then you'd be like, then you would definitely be turned into a pod person because they'd be like, he's dangerous. Let's bust out one of these fucking. What were those big pod-like Pokemon called in the original Pokemon? Do you remember those?
The ones that like Caterpie evolved into before it evolved into
Seedle?
like.
Was that what it was called? I cannot remember. But that's what it reminded me of, because they're these big things that they carry around and transport as a.
But what it reminded me of, and I actually rewatched this today, was the Batman TAS episode House and Garden, which is one of my favorites. Definitely the best Poison Ivy episode, I think.
Yes, especially the 70s version, given the imagery. I was surprised how much of the destruction of some of the pod people that we see in the 50s version we actually see.
Yeah.
But it's like we've been saying, it's nothing like what you see in the 70s version. They just go into way more detail and they show way more gore.
I saw an interview with Kevin McCarthy. By the way, the cocoon Pokemon that Caterpie evolves into is called Metapod. So I don't know if that's what you were talking about.
Not Seedle. Yeah, well, that's what I was talking about. I just couldn't remember the name. I don't know why Seedle was in my head. I don't know if that's a thing or.
Anyway, so yeah, I saw an interview with Kevin McCarthy, and he was talking about the film, and apparently they went in and they had like full to create the pod people effect. They went in and they basically had like full casts of themselves made in like plaster of Paris. You hear about that all the time these days. Like that became very standard practice that actors would go in and get like live casts done for this effect or that effect. But in 1956, I have to imagine that was pretty rare. Like I don't think I've ever heard of that being done that far back. At least not that I can think of. You know what I mean? So I don't know if they were on the cutting edge of that, but
they seem to have been. I mean, first of all, it's really impressive, obviously, for the time, given that it's definitely got to be one of the earliest attempts to do something like this. Certainly one of the earliest attempts I've ever seen. But it's hard to distinguish what is actually a person sitting on the ground and what is a big puppet ostensibly that is there to look all mutated and stuff. But it all looks really cool, and it's also odd how it looks really consistent between the two versions. Like the 70s version doesn't radically change how the pods look. Like they look pretty much the same. They're just you just kind of see more of them.
Right, and they actually like around and stuff,
Yeah. But the actual design is pretty much the same.
Yeah, the effects in the 70s version are also top notch for 1978.
But it's not unusual. Like I got mad. Like when I watched it, I was like, oh, I want to go back and watch the thing.
There was one really odd special effect, with the dog.
Yeah, that was okay. First of all, why? I mean, it was creepy as hell, but why?
Yeah.
What happened there?
I wish it had been better explained. So Donald Sutherland kicks this pod that is lying next to this hobo that he knows and his dog. And we've seen this hobo and the dog all throughout the movie. Donald Sutherland with Pat Street.
Whatever his name is, and the dog's called Pooch. Yeah, Harry and Pooch.
He can't wake the homeless person up, so he kicks the pod and it starts to bleed, and I guess he thinks the pod is dead, but really all he's done is damaged it. And as a result, it fucks up and it sort of copies both of them at the same time. So you wind up with this dog that has a human face. And
but I had forgotten about that. So when it showed up, I was like, "What? Why did that happen?" And I had forgotten that the pod had been damaged. So I guess that's just my memory. Yeah. It's my fault, but still,
I kind of wish it was more clearly explained. But that's supposed to be the idea,
right? Now
I
that I think about that in retrospect, it makes sense.
Yeah, and the way they achieved that effect was about as simple as it can be. They literally just put a mask on a dog.
I mean, you don't see it for that long, and I think that's why it's so creepy. Like, you just kind of get a vague idea of it, and then he just kind of runs off. Because, again, it's so fucking freaky.
Yeah, the first time I saw the movie, I thought, oh, that's just weird for the sake of weirdness. But then when I rewatched the movie, I realized that it was there for a very specific reason. The dog with the human face comes out. It scares Brooke Adams. She screams, and then that's how the other pod people catch on that she's not a pod person
Right,
because she showed
right.
up. There was something different in the '50s version. Somebody, I think it was somebody almost got hit by a car or something, and the woman yells, "Watch out!" And then the cop looks at her because he realizes she's not a pod person.
Right, right.
Kind of the same thing. But yeah, the '70s version, they see the dog with the human face. She freaks out. One of this little old woman pod person points at her and does like the shriek thing, and then Donald Sutherland just fucking clocks her.
Right,
Great.
right. There's a lot more violence in the 70s version as well.
There is.
Um, but yeah.
Uh, so other differences in the Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956, the main character is a doctor, Dr. Bennell, and in the remake he was changed into a health inspector, and
Yeah,
it
I thought
kind of
that
goes
was interesting.
it kind of goes into the change of aesthetic. It's because the remake took the plot out of small town America and into a big city. I think it's
Right,
San
that's the
Francisco.
real change here.
Yeah, and I think it's a smart idea because it's easier for the pod people to branch out and sort of start taking over the world from like a big city.
It
Because
makes it
in
more
the
of a spectacle, doesn't it?
yeah, I mean in the original movie it was very clear that they could achieve it as well. They were like going out to all the other little small towns, and then eventually you take over enough small towns, and eventually you get to like a big city. But in this, it just starts in this city, and it's going to branch out from there. And
Well, I think
they had to.
they put it in that very small town intentionally to keep it cut off, so that way they could have that somewhat hopeful ending at the end, or at least leave it ambiguous as to whether or not they would go out and conquer the world. You know?
Right. Well, it's cool because you get the sort of paranoia in the small town. That whole idea. It also keeps budgets lower. But
Right. Yeah, they can
yeah,
film it
but
on a back lot somewhere as opposed to going to a location like a city like they would have to in the 70s version.
yeah, but in the '70s version, moving the pod invasion to a city has its own advantages. A city, there's more people. They don't pay as much attention to each other, so it's more, believable that this infection could spread for so long without people picking up on it. They have the threat is enhanced because they have the advantage of like having a dock. They can like infect ships. They have an airport that can infect airplanes. You know, so there's different
We
advantages.
see more detail of how the pods work as well. Like we see the flowers. Like we see the whole opening credits is them coming to Earth, and we see them come
Yeah,
down, and we see them grow on trees, and we can see that they're somewhat adaptable to spreading to where they have to go. So,
yeah. I like that
I
opening.
like that we see all that. And
Yeah, because
what I
then
also
later on,
liked about these things, and what makes them very different from stuff like John Carpenter's The Thing, or any number of other shape shifting alien type creatures, is that they can't just like take over. They don't take over somebody's body. They become somebody's body and take over their memories on their own, and then they destroy the other body in the process. And that makes it all the creepier, and we see a lot more of that in the 70s version.
the other
Um,
thing that the other thing that really works about the whole about both of these films, this is a strength of both of them. If you don't know the plot of Invasion of the Body Snatchers and you go in to watch either of these movies, if you've never heard of them or you just don't know what the deal is and you watch either of these movies, there's a really nice mystery build up. You know,
sure.
you know, if you know, and if you already know the deal behind Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I mean, I already knew what Invasion of the Body Snatchers was about before I ever saw either of the films. Uh, if you know ahead of time, then it's still very enjoyable because you get to watch the characters working it out. But you can go into either of these films and not know what's going on, and have a similar experience. But it would be more of a mystery that was unfolding before you. I really like in the '70s version, like you said, we open up with the space spores, sort of leaving that planet and coming to Earth. And then later on in the film, when Leonard Nimoy sort of explains what's going on, if you're a person who doesn't know what Invasion of the Body Snatchers is going in, that sort of clicks it for you. It makes the connection. Good stuff. In the 50s version, there's a similar sort of doctor character, and he comes in and he gives a very similar explanation. Uh, I don't know that there are flowers in this version, but he talks about seeds drifting through space that landed in a farmer's field and turned into pods, and then spread from there.
Who says that
But
in the
yeah,
50s version?
it's the 50s version of Leonard Nimoy's character. He's like the psychologist who tries to convince Kevin McCarthy that he's imagining things.
Right, okay.
Him and Jack take him back.
But he
to
suggests the explanation of seeds drifting through space.
He doesn't suggest the explanation. He explains it because by that point he's already a pod person, and in fact he may have been a pod person all along. We don't really know.
Right. Well, I was figured that anyway because he was a dickhead and trying to convince him he was crazy, so he probably was. At least
Leonard
by that
Nimoy's
point.
character. Leonard Nimoy's character. It's a little bit more clear. I think he's a pod person throughout the entire movie.
Yeah. He strikes me as like a leader.
Yeah, but if you listen to the director's commentary, there's a moment where Phil Kaufman says, "And now Leonard Nimoy is a pod person." I was like, "Oh, was he not supposed to be one before?" Because he was like convincing people that they were just like imagining that their loved ones had changed.
He blames
That's
it
the
all
really
on the women, on their marital issues and running away from those problems head on. That's what he
that's the
blames it
other
on.
that's the other really interesting aspect about both of these movies is somebody in a family will get turned into a pod person, and most people won't notice the difference. But there's usually like one or two people around them who will notice that there's something off. There's the woman in the original film who is convinced that her uncle is no longer her uncle. In the 70s version, they actually moved that conflict to one of the main characters. We have Brooke Adams, the love interest, becomes convinced that something is wrong with her husband.
Which is a
and,
good
and
idea. I liked that.
Yeah, and we get to see her following him around and trying to figure out what's going on. That was all great stuff. And again, that's that like really great mystery element if you went into this movie blind and didn't know what you were in for. Uh, it's actually a real mental illness too. There's this thing, I forget what it's called, but there's this thing that happens sometimes where people will become convinced that their loved one has been replaced with like a duplicate. There have been like cases of women who will, completely.
This is something that was known before the book was written and before the movies came out, right?
I would assume so.
So obviously,
I mean,
this is somewhat inspired by that kind of paranoia.
yeah, and again, that's my assumption. I don't know if this was a well-known thing or if the author knew about this illness, but it's a real thing. There are cases of mothers who become convinced that their children have been replaced and then sort of abandon them. It's the crazy.
That is crazy. My God.
But
I mean,
anyway,
after the movie would come out, like that, I imagine they're like blaming it on the movie, which would be terrible. A brand new Comics Code type of deal would arise.
The political aspect of the film is also very interesting. The people who make the film who made the film, and I'm pretty sure the original writer as well. I'm not sure. They have said that there wasn't supposed to be like a political message, and this is a common thing that happens. With sci-fi films, people will say, "Oh, we were just making a fun movie," and then everybody, that was the thing with Planet of the Apes. Oh, I never knew that there was
right
race stuff in there. Yeah, the people who made Invasion of the Body Snatchers, they were like, there wasn't supposed to be a message. It just sort of happened. And what's really genius about it is that it works no matter which side of the aisle you're on. So if you're super liberal, you would look at it as like a commentary on like the McCarthy era. You would see it as like the Crucible, but with aliens. But if you're on the opposite side of the spectrum, you would look at it as being about the Red Scare. The idea of communist infestation, and the transition from sort of this emotional state of being human to this sort of cold, calculating alien existence, which is very very in line with how people would have viewed communists at the time. So it works no matter which side of the spectrum you're on. The difference in the 70s version, I mean, it's still the Cold War era. There's still like Red Scare stuff going on, so you could still read that into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's still there. It's just not at the forefront.
Right. But there are other bits of social commentary in there as well. I love that they used Leonard Nimoy's character to tackle the sort of pop psychology thing that really
That's one
boomed in the
thing.
set.
Sexual frustrations and issues are also at the forefront. Like STDs
Yeah.
is in there. At one point they're like, "Is it contagious?" And
Yeah.
he's like, "Why? Well, why would you ask that?"
Leonard Nimoy has a moment where he mentions the like the divorce rate skyrocketing and shit. Like there's lots of stuff in there that's tailored more towards the 70s. Afros, of course, there are afros, which are obviously more. Yeah,
There are
this is,
black people at all.
there aren't black people at all. Donald Sutherland has the most magnificent afro, and he's a white man,
He's
but
great. He's not
he is
somebody you see in a whole lot of stuff, but whenever he pops up, he's always really good.
yeah, he's really good in this movie. But yeah, I love that use of the psychologist character of Leonard Nimoy to sort of take on the whole like pops because from what I understand, from what I've seen, from my knowledge, the 70s is really when that like exploded, and it was in like book form, and nowadays it's like on television. You have your Dr. Phil's and shit, but like back then it was like, oh, this guy he writes these books and they're great and they change my life. He's that kind of a character, and he's clearly kind of a.
These kind of
I mean,
spiritual guru types who use psychology in that way.
yeah, like he's obviously educated. Like he knows his shit as far as psychology is concerned. But there's also an element of like of bull to like what he's selling, I think. And I like the
Well,
contentious
and it's
relationship.
a sort of like popular manipulation through mass appeal
Yeah, and I like the
by
sort of
telling people what they want to hear.
yeah, and I like the antagonistic relationship between him and Jeff Goldblum because Jeff Goldblum, also a writer, realizes all of that about Leonard Nimoy's character, and he's angry because he hasn't had any success, and Leonard Nimoy has sort of become this famous figure for writing all this stuff, which Jeff Goldblum views as
It's nice to see
basically
that Jeff Goldblum was always the same, even when he was young. Because in every movie he's ever in, he just talks until he conquers the scene. You know? Like, that's all he ever does, is he just rants and raves until he takes over the scene with whatever he's trying to say. And in this, like, do you think that there is a kind of, in the 70s version, there is a kind of representation of the two political aspects on the themes of the invasion of the body snatchers that you mentioned before? Like, you have your Jeff Goldblums and you have your Leonard Nimoys, and by the third act, they're both pod people. Where you have your somewhat more conservative mindset, and then you have your somewhat more liberal mindset.
I don't know that. I almost called him Dr. Spock. I don't know that Leonard Nimoy's character is necessarily conservative, though.
Not
But
necessarily, although his mindset on divorce is a little more conservative.
yeah, but I could see how that might be a factor. I mean, Jeff Goldblum and his wife, which wonderful performance from Veronica Cartwright, who is an actress who I've really come to appreciate. Considering that I used to fucking hate her guts because the only thing that I knew her from was Alien, and she really
Right,
annoyed me
she's
in that.
she's from Alien. That was the only thing I recognized her from.
Well, and the other thing I realized recently that I never knew. See, I actually knew her from more than just Alien because it turns out that when she was a small child, she played Kathy, the little girl from The Birds.
Oh well, all
Uh,
right, there you go.
yeah, Rod Taylor's little sister. So that's interesting. And then she was in this and then Alien, and that's really all I know of her. I don't know if she did anything else, which is sad because I think she has the. I had a revelation today, and I posted
She,
this
I
on
mean,
Facebook.
I mean, it could have been typecasting. Like, she never got any other roles that gave her any kind of chance to be anything more than what she was known for.
Yeah, perhaps. I had sort of a revelation about her today. I realized that I think she would have made a better Wendy in The Shining than Shelley Duvall was, because she has that same like hysteria thing. She does that exact same thing in just about every movie I've ever seen her in, but she's not as irritating as Shelley Duvall was in
Do
that
you think
movie.
maybe she's more charismatic about it?
I think she is. I think she is, and I think she's also a slightly better actress. But
She
uh,
definitely has like the best role at the end because she's the only one who's human at the end. And
okay. Now I'm looking at uh, a list of the movies she's in. She's in more things that I recognize than I realized, but I really only know her from the three. But
Mm. I was
anyway,
somewhat irritated with her at a certain point, although when they revealed that she was the one who figured out, like, oh, they can be fooled if you pretend to not have any emotions. I really liked that.
yeah. Well, what I
So,
liked about her was that she was the most hippie of any character in the movie, and
right.
she's the one who really figures out what's going on. You know, Donald Sutherland and Jeff Goldblum are
That I
running
really
around and
like. I like that she's not an idiot, and none of the people in the '70s version really come off as an idiot to me, and I liked that because in the
yeah,
'50s version, there's a little bit of idiocy going on.
she's super into like well, she has this like botany hobby, so she already knows things about plants. You know, she talks. There's one scene where she's talking to this guy about how she plays music and she runs like a mud spa. She runs music in there because it is good for the plants. So like she knows about that kind of stuff. She's also like super into like uh ancient astronaut theory. Like she starts talking about like the aliens that
Yep, I
came.
noticed that as well, and I was wondering if they were gonna explain that, like, oh, the body snatchers have been here before, and they created humanity from in the first place, and this is just like a second breeding session or whatever. But
Yeah,
no,
no,
they don't. That would have been stupid to explain that. I mean, sure,
right.
if you want to imply that yourself, whatever. I don't like that, but if you want
No,
to do that yourself, fine.
that doesn't fit at all, and I don't think that's why it's there. I think it's
No,
just
it's
supposed to be
not. It's not. It's just there to show what kind of person she is and how she
right.
views
And
the
like
world.
Leonard Nimoy with the whole pop psychology thing, the '70s is
She's
when
there to
like that.
represent an aspect of pop culture.
Right, the '70s is when that idea came to the fore. You know, the whole. I think that book, Chariot of the Gods, was published in the '70s, wasn't it?
Leonard Nimoy was involved in one of the early documentaries that was made out of that book, "Chariots of the Gods" by Edric Van Anakin or whatever the hell that guy's name is.
Yeah. Okay, so the book apparently was written in 1968, but like obviously, so that was right before the '70s started, and then the documentary was made in 1970. So this was a very late '60s or all throughout the '70s idea that she has sort of latched onto, and it's just another way that they sort of updated the movie for the '70s. You know, the '70s is this weird period, and we've talked about this before, like when they. It's the reason that Jordan Vogt Roberts decided to set Kong Skull Island in the '70s. It's this weird period where like there was still some mystery in the world, you know, right before we pretty much figured everything out. So like
Right. The '80s
there's a
came
lot of
along and spoiled everything.
so there's a lot of room for that sort of thing, and I think this movie fits really really well into that sort of conversation. But yeah, so I like that.
I love that kind of stuff because what the '70s version does, that stuff that I love, like King Kong '76, and I'm trying to think of another example of like a remake from this period that updates it for the decade in a way that is an expansion on the original concept, as opposed to, well, people nowadays won't get it unless we do this.
Yeah,
It's there because, oh, this says something about something now, which will benefit updating it as opposed to leaving it the same as it was in the original. I like in Kong '76, they did it in such a way where it made sense to commentate on now with the concept of King Kong, as opposed to setting it in the '30s and doing the same thing over again. Same thing in Body Snatchers, and they probably justify it more in Body Snatchers than they even do in Kong.
yeah.
Uh, so
But yeah, it's very easy to look at that character and sort of write her off because she's just sort of this weird hippie chick who believes in ancient astronauts. But but then she's really, and I didn't realize this until after the movie when I was thinking about it. While Donald Sutherland and Jeff Goldblum are running around, trying to figure out what's going on with their fucking thumbs up their asses, she's the one that pretty much figures it out.
mm,
Like she's a step ahead of them because she's like turned on to all this weird sort of paranormal shit that they just write off as because they're just regular dudes living their lives, so it never really occurs to them. But she's sort of tuned into this.
They're also all freaked the fuck out. That's another thing that's, I think, more emphasized in the 70s version. Like in the 50s version, like I said, their solution to every problem is the drink. But in the 70s version, they freak the hell out, and there's a lot more emotional vulnerability, and they curse and they, punch walls and stuff. It's a lot more unstable.
Yeah, especially in the 50s version, they find out that their loved ones have been replaced by pod people, and they recover from that pretty quickly.
Like I said, their solution to every problem is to just drink it away.
There's a moment where the main actress realizes, oh, my father is a pod person, and he tried to convert me last night. And usually if you find out that your parent tried to convert you to a different religion in your sleep, you might freak out. You might have a reaction. I was waiting for like here's her acting moment. But no, it was just
instead the romance between her and the doctor Bennett like swells more and more.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, I guess in the 50s version, the pod people must like grow clothing, because at the end of the movie when she gets turned into a pod person, she just has unless she like, first of all, that whole thing happened way too quickly to be credible.
Yep.
Unless the explanation is she was already partially converted because of when there was the one in her basement, so maybe it just didn't take as long. I don't know. But like apparently, while Kevin McCarthy was away, she fell asleep, got replaced with a pod person, and then that pod person must have put on all of her clothing very, very quickly.
Right.
I was so glad.
Put herself in like a similar position to where she was. Yep, all that shit. My mom is convinced that there was no other pod person, that she like that the pod like inhabited her body, because that's what must have happened, because it happened so quickly. But
I mean, I don't know.
But yeah, and any way you slice it, it's weird.
Yeah, I was glad in the 70s version when Brooke Adams gets turned into a pod person.
Yeah,
she's just
it's a lot
fucking
more
naked.
Direct.
She's fucking naked, because that you would be. It's also a much better take on that scene, because Donald Sutherland comes back and finds her asleep, and he tries to wake her up, and then you actually see her disintegrate in his hands, and he like has that wonderful reaction, and then he just hears her voice and turns around, and there's the pod her standing there, and it's super creepy.
Yeah, especially when she's like, "They were right. It's super painless." Oh, it's good stuff. Although I was wondering about when she decomposes. Does that happen to everybody?
Yeah. The original body sort of disintegrates.
I mean, they don't show that at any point earlier in the movie, and that's not in the 50s version. It's implied that they have to kill the other person. That's what I thought.
They hint at it, though. Okay, so earlier on in the film, after her husband gets turned into a pod person, she wakes up and she sees him like sweeping something up next to the bed. And she asks him, like, what are you doing? And he never responds. And then he goes out the back door, and when she goes to see what he's doing, he, like, gives something to the garbage man, and he, like, drives it off in the trash truck. The garbage dude is a pod person. And that guy just swept up his disintegrated former corpse.
Oh, okay.
The garbage person. And then later on in the film, when they're trying to figure out what happened to the to the body that was in the mud spa, at one point they hear a noise and they look out the window and there's another garbage truck there, and they don't really think anything about it. But if you've been paying attention, it's like, oh, there's that garbage truck again.
Waiting for Jack's corpse?
See, I don't know if the garbage pod person snuck in and stole the corpse that was supposed to be there, or if the pod body disintegrated because the conversion process failed. That's something that I would have liked to have been explained in both versions of the movie.
Yeah, well, the idea seems to be implied that like it gets up on its own and it opens the window, but I guess not if the garbage truck was there.
Right. I guess I would imagine that if it fails to complete the process and take over the other person's appearance, then the pod body would like disintegrate or just or just die, and then the other pod people have to come and collect it. Like I think
that could have been clearer, and it wouldn't have ruined the mystique of the concept at all. It just would have made it more hard hitting as to what's happening to the people. We just don't get enough of a good sense of that.
Yeah, the idea in the original movie, at least to me, seems to be that the policeman had come and taken those bodies because he was already a pod person. He came and took the bodies that had failed
I
to.
also didn't put that together, but all right. You apparently put together all the threads that I just didn't see.
Because what I think happened, the pod people, especially in the '50s version, well, actually in both versions, because there's all those scenes of Brooke Adams' husband like going to like those secret meetings and shit. But the pod people seem to be very strategic in the way they do things. So I think they start off by infecting like police officers and shit like that, things that they can use, and then they just start, converting the populace one by one. Because it seems to be that like anybody in a position of authority has already been turned into a pod person. The police are pod people. The psychiatrist is a pod person. I wouldn't be surprised if all the doctors in the town, except for Kevin McCarthy, who just got back into town, are already pod people because they're like, oh, it's just a mass hysteria that's like somehow infectious. And they try to sell them on that bullshit. But you could read it either way. Either they're pod
Well, I
people
mean,
or
that's
they're
how he gets out of it in the original, is that he is returning to town from some kind of convention or something. And
Yeah.
so
Well,
is
what's great
his, so
about
is his love interest, so they both get
Yeah.
introduced to it late after it's already taken a hold in the town.
Right. But you can read that two ways. Either those doctors are already pod people and they're lying to him, or they are still human at that point and they're just saying that because that's the only theory that they have. Because genuinely that's probably what they would think because it's all you
Yeah,
really could
you
think.
can read it either way. And I like that.
Nobody's going to leap to space plants when they're trying to figure out why this is happening. So, although maybe they should have.
If they did, they probably wouldn't have been taken over by them so easily, but because of their blind, stupid ignorance, they got taken over by some wacky space plants.
Okay, so the '50s version, there's very much more of a build in terms of like the weirdness. So, he comes back to town, everything seems fine. And then over the course of the film, things start to happen that are weird, and it all starts to pile up. And by the time Jack finds the body in his house, that's when it really just slammed on the gas. But there's a
He
build,
decides to take this thing into his own hands.
yeah, there's a build to the crazy shit that's happening, and in the '70s version, that's also true on a plot level. But what's really good about the '70s version, and the main thing that causes me to give it the edge when we talk about which one we like better, is there's something off from the very beginning, and it's done through like atmosphere and like shit that's happening in the background.
There's
Like,
no
okay,
pretense in the 70s version.
So we talked about the Robert Duvall cameo at the beginning. That's obviously a really weird thing that's happening. But all throughout the movie, long before Donald Sutherland or Brooke Adams or anybody has caught on that there's anything wrong, there will be, random people running in the background. We don't know what they're running from, but they're just running, The idea being that obviously they figured out what's going on and they're probably being pursued by pod people. I mean, the famous Kevin McCarthy cameo, he gets pursued by a very large crowd of pod people.
But I feel like you can't have what the 70s version puts forth without the 50s version. Because again, there's no pretense in the 70s version. They open showing you the pod people, the pods themselves coming to Earth and infecting the first couple of people.
Like I said before,
So I don't think you can have that kind of direct, like, this is Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You guys have all seen this. You know what this is. Here's a more expansive, modern version of it. So I don't feel like you could, but I don't feel like you can do that without having an audience that is familiar with this concept already through the 50s version.
That's the thing. I talked about this earlier. I think it works both ways. If you already know what the Invasion of the Body Snatchers is about, if you're already familiar with the 50s version, or even if you've never seen the 50s version and you just know about it through reputation, then you can watch the movie and you know what's going on, but it's about watching the characters figure it out, and it's about the tension. You know what's happening and they don't, and so you get that whole suspense thing that Alfred Hitchcock always used to talk about, which there's tons of suspense.
Well, there's still a mystique as to who's a pod person when and if they are.
That's true. That's true. So there's that element as well, and then there's a lot more suspense in the '70s version, just because there's a lot more like filmmaking technique going into it. '50s movie is
It's
a
well,
is a
it's
beat.
weird. It's weirder in the '70s version. It's more psychedelic. It's more psychological. The '50s
It has
version. What I
it
like
has
about the '50s version, though, is that it is more traditional. So the creepiness is subtler, and the abnormalities are more understated. So it's more about the bizarreness in people's behavior and the little subtle inconsistencies in the way people walk and awkwardness and stuff.
Yeah. But that's how it works, again, if you're familiar with the story. If you go into either movie not knowing what it's about, I still think it would work because you would go into the '70s movie thinking, okay, this is really weird and I don't really know what's happening and there's sort of a mystery unfolding here. And by the end of it, especially when Leonard Nimoy gives his speech about where he basically explains what's happening, it would click and you'd be like, oh my God, you know. So I think that if we lived in a world where the '50s version had never been made and like the '70s version was the only one that existed, it would obviously be it would obviously have a few less cameos because there wouldn't be a '50s version in that alternate timeline. But I think it would still work just for that reason alone. It would be like a mystery unfolding before you, and there would still be some
I don't
people
think
in
they
that
would
alt.
have done it that way though had the '50s version not been made. Is my point though. I
And
think
then
they decided to do it that way because it's something that they were already familiar with.
now in that alternate timeline scenario I just laid out, there probably would still be a few people watching the '70s version who knew what the movie was going to be about because maybe they had read the book. But
But I don't know if they would have approached it the same way. I feel like there would have been more pretense because it would have been the first time that it would have been on screen. I don't think they would have opened in space and having the things coming to Earth be the opening credits.
if it was the same people making it with the same sensibilities,
Maybe
I don't
it's
know.
impossible to know. We can't travel there and ask them unless you'd like to try.
It's an interesting question.
Take five and give it a shot.
As soon as we invent the Rick and Morty portal gun, batteries not included, I will. I'll give that a shot. Uh,
Until then, we'll never know, though. And all I can say is that I think I ultimately prefer the subtlety of the original, and also in terms of the who's who and what exactly makes the pod people different and bizarre as opposed to the regular people, and also the kind of moral ambiguity of what our main characters have to go through to deal with the pod people and their existential questions about their own individuality versus what exactly everybody else is becoming, and whether or not it'll even be them if they go through this. Like, all that stuff I thought was I kind of found that more thought-provoking than the original. And not to say that it's not thought-provoking in the '70s version, but I think, again, because that was already done, the '70s version doesn't spend as much individual time kind of playing with that idea as it does doing its own thing with it and going on to other avenues. It's a lot more about the individual characters in the '70s version as well. I feel like the '50s version is more idea based, and it's also a lot more focused on the romance. And the '70s version also gets a lot into that, but it's the '70s version works it into the pod people thing, whereas the '50s version that doesn't happen until the very end. So
yeah. It's also a better romance. Like I buy it more. We know
well,
that they're
that's without question because it's the '70s as opposed to the '50s. It is still a
working
very
better.
'70s romance, but what makes it good is that I like the female character in the dynamic, whereas a lot of the time they would they would be annoying or a stereotype. But I really liked her, and I didn't like the '50s romantic lead as much.
Well, the other thing that really makes it work is that there's a history there that we understand. So in the '50s version, we're told that Dr. Bedell and this girl have known each other for years, but we really don't know what that consists of. or how close they've ever been. We really don't know any of those things. They sort of hint at it here and there in dialogue, but we don't really know. In the '70s version, they both work at the health department together. They're work colleagues. He brings her things from his health inspections and she analyzes them. They've got a working relationship. They clearly appreciate each other as friends. And they're clearly not interested in each other romantically at the beginning. It's only after her husband becomes a fucking pod person that sort of romance blossoms.
Well, Donald Sutherland doesn't have a good impression of her boyfriend the entire time. Like, every time she tries to express her concerns about him, he makes some snide remark about him.
Yeah.
So I think he's interested in her the entire time. He just doesn't show it openly until like a third of the way in.
Yeah, that could be that could be the case. You're probably right now that I think about that. But yeah, it's just it's a better romance. It's better explained. That's another one of the things about the '70s version that is superior to the '50s version. The characters, because again, the '50s version are very archetypal. But everybody in the '70s version.
But I don't. I think it works in a different way because, it's more.
Yeah, well, I mean,
because it is the '50s and it's working with those archetypes to, create this sense of comfort that we then have to destroy by having the pod people come in. So I think it works in its own context. But yeah, on an interpersonal level, the '70s version has better characters, to be sure.
I mean, the '50s version has that thing that I love in any good sci-fi movie, especially from that period. It feels like an extended episode of The Twilight Zone, just without Rod Serling at the beginning.
Absolutely, and I think that it's because the acting is so good that the movie is so good. If you didn't have actors reading those words with any kind of charisma, it wouldn't work. But because they are charismatic, it makes you believe what you're seeing is real and that it's real people going through this thing. And without that, it wouldn't be impactful at all. But it is because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, the actors in the original film, for the most part, are very good as well, especially Kevin McCarthy. It's just that most of them aren't given much to do, aside from Kevin McCarthy.
Like I said, everybody just kind of sits around and drinks, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, so we don't really get to see them do much, but the characters in the '70s version are very well fleshed out, very very, very standard. I mean, I love the introduction to Donald Sutherland's character. We pick up with him, on his job doing a health inspection, and there's that great little funny exchange.
He finds
in the kitchen.
rat turd in the soup.
Yeah, and they're like, it's a caper. He's like, it's a rat turd. It's a caper, and he says, if it's a caper, you eat it. And then he gives him this look. He's like, you win, sir. Touche.
And then they destroy his car.
Yeah, it's a great scene. It's a great scene. So you're on his side right from the beginning. Brooke Adams has you're on her side too because of the whole thing with her husband. So you get drawn in.
Boyfriend. They're not married, I don't think.
Yeah, even Leonard Nimoy, just by virtue of the fact that he's Leonard Nimoy, really sucks you in, even though he doesn't do much in the film that is particularly admirable.
They spend more time giving us a glimpse at who these people are and what motivates them on their own terms, as opposed to the '50s version, which goes, here's what this person does in a general sense, and now we're developing the mystery. I think that I think that is more, again, I think it's more iconic, and I think it's more efficient at getting to the point. But I think the '70s version is more, I guess, more emotionally disturbing because of the more drawn out characters in that way.
Yeah. I wish perhaps that Jeff Goldblum had a little bit more to do, but I realize, of course, this is 1978, and Jeff Goldblum was not yet the Jeff Goldblum that we.
Yeah, but that's a problem in both versions with that character of Jack, is he just kind of sits around and whines the whole time, and then at the very end he gets turned into a pod person off screen.
Yeah, it's especially unfortunate because in both versions, I feel like they could do so much more. Because I mean, the '70s version, it's Jeff Goldblum. What else do I need to say? But even in the '50s version, that actor strikes me as being a very capable actor.
Like I said, the cast in both movies is really good. But yeah, at a certain point in both, I feel everybody's just kind of sitting around dealing with the enormous consequences of what they're doing. And like I said, there's dumb shit in both movies. There's that really annoying thing where, you know, in a good horror, thriller, science fiction film, usually your characters will be acting like rational, reasonable, common sense filled individuals throughout the entire thing. And that's largely present in both versions, more so in the 70s version. But in both, there's just moments where people do dumb stuff. In the 70s version, the one that jumped out to me was, yeah, good idea, Donald Sutherland. Go sleep outside when aliens are trying to get at you and your friends. Good on you.
Yeah, I don't think he intended to fall asleep. Like I got the intent, like sometimes you're just sitting around and you fall asleep. I got the feeling that that's what happened to him there. Like I think he just went outside to sit down and look at the stars, and he wound up falling asleep. So I don't know if that was necessarily a bad move as much as it was just an unfortunate accident.
One other
What about
really dumb thing that I noticed in the 50s version was, and this is there's something like this in the 70s version, but I thought it was more understandable. So, at one point, the doctor, Bunnell, is just like suddenly he just senses a disturbance in the force, and he's just like, there's something wrong over at my girlfriend's house. He drives over in his fucking pajamas and leaves his car running and in drive in front, and like he doesn't even park it in front of her house. He runs inside, runs up to her bedroom, starts shaking her around. Then he goes into the basement and he finds the pod person that's becoming her. And the whole time, my mom and I were dying laughing because the car is in the front of the house running in drive. It's going to drive up onto the fucking lawn and run everybody over. So there's dumb stuff that just people they just didn't think about, you know?
Yeah.
That could have been handled better.
Do you remember what it was in the 70s version that made Donald Sutherland realize that he needed to go over to Brooke Adams' house and save her? Do you remember? It wasn't like just like
no, it was not a disturbance in the force. I cannot remember what it was. I don't think she called her. I mean, I don't think she called him. Oh, okay. No, I remember now. He just puts two and two together after he finds the body in the spa. He figures, well, if this thing is copying Jack, and it's copying him exactly, and he puts it together.
Right, okay.
He puts it together that what was her character's name?
I don't remember. That's why I keep calling her Brooke Adams. But he realizes that must be what happened to her.
Yeah,
husband,
he realizes that her boyfriend has already gone through this and that she's in danger. And coincidentally, at this very moment, a pod person is about to take her.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, it does make a lot more sense. So again, the 50s version has dumber stuff, but the 70s version has its own dumb stuff, like that thing I mentioned before. If any others come to mind, I will definitely bring them up.
We've done a lot of compare contrast. Is there anything like specifics about either movie that you'd like to get into?
I mean, we've talked a lot about the cast. I also really like just talk a little more about the 50s version. We've talked a lot about the 70s version, I feel. I really like the nurse of Dr. Bunnell. They sort of amalgamize her into one character in the 70s version with Brooke Adams' character. In terms of the nurse and the love interest.
Her name's Elizabeth, by the way. I just looked it up.
I remember that now. I remember. But when she becomes a pod person, that's also really creepy because, she's the one kind of keeping his office together. And, you have that element in the 50s version of him being a small-town doctor, so he sees everybody. And that was cool, because as everybody starts to become a pod person, he's connected to everybody and everybody knows him. So he's kind of dangerous to them because he's able to put two and two together that there's something wrong, because he knows what everybody is supposed to be like.
Yeah. That's one advantage to the 50s version over the 70s version, I think, is that him being the doctor, he's the one who sort of picks up that something weird is going on. Where in the '70s version, it's Elizabeth Brooke Adams who figures out that there's something going on because of what's going on with her husband. I like that she gets to be more of a part of it than the girl in the first movie did because of this thing going on with her husband. But I wish maybe Donald Sutherland had a more active role in figuring out what's going on.
Right, because in the '50s version, it's his love interest's cousin or something, or sister, and it's their uncle who's been replaced by a pod person initially, and then it's his love interest's father who gets replaced, but that happens later.
Yeah.
I also preferred the scene in the '50s version, and I think it's just the small town setting that made this more believable, where they come in and they're talking about bodies disappearing, and the cop comes in and is asking them all to explain what's going on and why he shouldn't arrest them. And the doctor guy is like, oh, my friends are having an emotional problem, then we're going to work it out on our own. That's so much more believable in a small town with only one police officer who is dealing with the small town doctor who sees everybody, and if he locks them up in jail, well, they're not going to have a doctor. Whereas in the '70s version, when Donald Sutherland shows up acting crazy, talking about kidnapping a woman in the middle of the night and bodies disappearing, in a big city with a bunch of cops around and crime scene investigators and forensics and all that, it's just so much less believable that he doesn't get hauled off in handcuffs, and that the police don't demand that he produce Elizabeth, I thought
Right.
that was that's another thing, that's another dumb thing that the '70s version does that popped into my mind.
I have a logic question concerning the '50s version actually that just
Okay.
occurred to me. So there's a scene after Miles and whatever the love interest name is, after they figured out what's going on and they're on the run from the pod people. There's a scene where they stop at a gas station, and while he uses the payphone, first of all, he's not even suspicious that the gas station guy might be a pod person, but
Yeah, that
whatever.
was stupid.
Well,
I also thought that was stupid.
but while he's using the payphone, the gas station attendant sneaks two pods into their trunk. And he realizes that something weird is going on halfway down the road because he had heard the guy poking around in the trunk, and he didn't think, oh well, shit, maybe he was a pod person until they get down the road. Then he opens the trunk and he finds the pods and he throws them out. And I think he lights them on fire, doesn't he? Uh, but
Yes.
if you and that sounds like a cool idea. Oh, the mechanic hid two pods in their trunk. But like, how would that have worked? Okay, so his plan was maybe they'll pull over and go to sleep. And even if that did happen, the pod people would then be in the trunk. Now, modern cars have a way, like a lot of them do, like if you've been kidnapped and stuffed into a trunk, there'll be a way to open the trunk from the inside. This is 1954, 6. What would those pod people have done? They would have died in that trunk.
Yeah. I almost wish that they would have put them somewhere else, or at least hid one somewhere else, because then there would be a better explanation for where his love interest's duplicate would come at the end. Oh no, they also,
Yeah.
although they ditched that car, so that wouldn't have worked either. Or is that in the
Yeah.
'70s version where he ditches the car and he puts the price sticker on it? No, that's the '50s version for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
That's a '50s kitschy, charming, action beat that I like. And then that's just the thing I like about the '50s version is it has that classy B event movie kind of spectacle feel, and it's really really good at that.
There's another
Like
question.
you said, it feels like a good episode of the Twilight Zone. It feels like when I watched the '50s version, I wanted to go back and watch Planet of the Apes. I had a very early sci-fi Planet of the Apes kind of vibe, apocalyptic, end of humanity being
Yeah.
replaced type of thing.
There's another question that both versions raise to me, and I wonder if this is better explained in the book. I don't know how close you have to be to one of these pods in order for them to make this connection to you. In the '50s version, especially, it seems like it's just some sort of a psychic connection because I mean,
I
she could
assume
be all
that's what it has to be.
because the girl could be all the way up in her bedroom, and the pod could be all the way down in the basement, and yet it will still work. The '70s version, there are times like when Donald Sutherland falls asleep outside where you will see like the sort of tendrils from the pod like
Where they
reach
have
up
to
to touch
touch, yeah.
Yeah. But then the other seed pods outside are growing into duplicates of the other people who are inside the house. So I don't guess they have to touch. Maybe it just helps. I don't know. That's
It
the big
seems
question.
almost like they're all building it off of Donald Sutherland's memories of the other people somehow. Because it almost seems like they're draining him specifically because he's totally conked out and he's all like, as opposed to just being asleep. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
super vague.
But then the other question is, okay, so
The
in the
70s
70s,
version is just weirder in general, though, so it almost feels like it's just part of that aesthetic.
yeah, in the 70s version, Brooke Adams falls asleep near the like factory where they're growing these pods. So you could assume that there was one close enough nearby to duplicate her. I'm fine with that. In the 50s version, we have no idea where the pod came from that turned what's her face into a pod person. We didn't see any around. We don't know if one of the other pod people like snuck up behind her and hid one there. We don't know what happened.
Yeah, no,
And again,
like we agreed earlier, that's way dumber in the 50s version, and it's actually really effective in the 70s version.
yeah. But yeah,
Although
so
one thing
there's
they both nail is that bit where, the Benel and his name is Benel in both versions, right? Donald Sutherland's character and McCarthy's character.
the difference is he's Miles, Dr. Miles Bennell in the 50s version, and Donald Sutherland's character is called Matthew Bennell.
Right.
And
Okay.
actually, his cameo in the movie, McCarthy is credited as playing Dr. Miles Bennell. So you can almost theorize
They're
that the
related.
original movie. You could theorize that they're related. You could also theorize that the original movie has taken place somewhere nearby in like a small town, and that he has run into the city looking for help. Uh,
It's
or a
possible.
version of the original movie anyway. Like a '70s version. Uh,
Which
so,
we can almost say is what we're watching.
so that's interesting.
Yeah,
But
sure.
yeah, what's your favorite scene from each movie?
Well, I was gonna say, one thing that I think they nail in both is the bit where the doctor or the health inspector hears the music and is like, "Oh, I hear music. I mean, there must be people nearby who enjoy music, so they must have some kind of emotion. So there might be survivors left who aren't us." So he goes off to investigate, and in both versions, he stumbles upon a mass production of the pods, and the music is being played on a radio, which then switches over to like some kind of really like objective monotone news speech, and then it gets switched off, and then we're just left with the apocalyptic imagery of the pod people being produced on a massive scale.
Right. Well, I mean, in the '70s,
I think they nail that in both versions. I prefer in the 50s version because it's left a little more open ended. In the 70s version, obviously we see Donald Sutherland go on this like quest to try and destroy it.
right. Well, in the '70s version, though, I like the reveal because he goes off. He hears Amazing Grace on the bagpipes, and he finds this ship. And then the people on the ship are probably still humans, I think, but they're loading pods onto this ship, and I don't think the people on the ship know
Right,
that
so
what they're.
grander scale, as we said.
Yeah, yeah. So it's this moment where you're like, oh shit, they're going global,
Right.
uh, which I mean, you had already gotten the idea that they were going to be spreading all over the United States because there was the meeting in the town square where they're like, if you have residents in fucking Denver, come over here, take a pod. Same thing that happened in the '50s version.
Right, well the
But
50s version going national is the big deal.
right,
In,
right.
in the 70s version, that already seems to have kind of taken place. It's more about going global. So it's
Well, we don't
certainly an
know.
increase in scale.
We don't know when the alien seeds or spores or whatever came into our atmosphere how widely distributed they are. So there is still an element of taking over the national stage because again we see people driving off to take pods to their relatives in this town or that town. But then they add another layer on top of it of like, and we're going global. And again, that's an advantage of setting it in a big city because in the original invasion, they wouldn't be able to go global until they conquered a big city that had like a
Yeah, well,
harbor and
there isn't that more simplified connective tissue between different parts of the world like there was in the 70s. Where traveling on a plane to England isn't as much of a big deal. Getting on a 2-day cruise ship to cross the ocean in that time to get to London isn't as big of a deal. you know?
Yeah, yeah. There's an increased level of connectivity. That is true. I'd like to see if they ever do another remake of this movie, which it seems inevitable at this point, as many as we've had. Uh, I'd like to see that explored more. The connected nature of our planet and the pod people using that against us.
They'd have to use Amazon somehow. Like the pods would come through Amazon. Now
Introduced on Amazon Pod.
Amazon was gonna say Amazon Pod. Uh, what I was gonna say though was you asked me what's my favorite scene from each version. The scene that leaps out to me from the '50s version that we don't really have in the '70s version is when the doctor and his love interest are in the office holding up after they've been kind of ousted as the only real people left in the town. Everybody else is pod people, and they're kind of watching the pod people go about their business in the early morning, and they're like, why are they up so early? And they're trying to figure it out, and Miles realizes, oh, it's because people from out of town who aren't pod people are coming in today, and they have to put on a little show for them like things are still normal. And then as soon as that's all done, you see this shift from they were pretending to be normal people back to, oh, we're all pod people. Let's get back to business. And they all just kind of converge on the center of town. I loved that. That was my favorite scene because we get to see it from an elevated point of view. It felt like we were kind of a fly on the wall, and it was another example of a subtler kind of creepiness and implied alien nature to the people that I preferred in the 50s version as opposed to the more psychedelic, off-putting, almost indie film feel to the 70s version.
Right, right. Favorite bit from the '70s version?
Oh, there is a question. I'm very tempted to say, and it's somewhat obvious. I mean, the bit where Donald Sutherland's pod person forms is just kind of incredible. It's like it's the equivalent of like the werewolf transformation of an American Werewolf in London in this movie.
Yeah.
But
I was going to mention that scene just because I mean we've pointed out some logical questions regarding that scene, but I think it's the creepiest scene in the movie.
Yeah.
I mean it's really fucking impactful, and the special effects that are at play there. Because again, it's a life cast of the actor, but now it's the '70s, and we've added animatronics, and it like moves around and shit, and it's really cool stuff.
Then again, one of my favorite things about the '70s version is the darker ending, so I almost want to say that.
Yes,
because the real kind of way to go, we're all fucked, is to have the protagonist become a pod person, and that last image has become iconic in and of itself. So
it has. That is definitely the best scene in the movie, I think. What I love about it is, for a while, you're not sure. You don't know if he's been turned into a pod person or if he's just, blending in like they were doing earlier. Because he's walking around, he's not saying anything, he's acting, just sort of silent and cold and emotionless. But he's looking around at things, he's inspecting things. You almost get the sense that he might still be in there and like he's trying to figure out something, to do. And so you're not quite sure. And then when Veronica Cartwright comes up and is like, Matthew, and she comes up and then he points at her and does the shriek, which is what a wonderful sound effect that they invented for the '70s version.
You've never seen Quatermass in the Pit, right?
No.
Movies where people just kind of walk around silently for several minutes. It's very off-putting because we're not used to it. Especially nowadays, we're used to things constantly happening, people constantly talking, sound constantly coming at us, music, sound effects, explosions, all that.
Yeah.
But for just several minutes of silence, it's odd, especially when we're seeing people do stuff on screen. And I had that with this, like in Quatermass in the Pit, because it just makes you question the humanity of a person. And it leads to that creepy twist of him not being human anymore at the end, because for several minutes you're just thinking, oh, well, he's contemplating the apocalyptic downfall of humanity, but in reality he's become part of it himself. So, yeah, I mean, it's the part of the movie that made me question whether or not I liked it better than the original, because I just preferred that approach to it, where this is not something that you can really fix. Like, once it starts, they're just going to keep going, you know, and they've done it a million times already. Like, what's different about Earth that's going to stop them, you know? So, and I think this being in the vein of something like the Twilight Zone ending would not have been a hopeful one had they done a story like this.
Yeah, it depends on the Twilight Zone episode, but knowing Rod Serling, if he had tackled this material, it would have ended much closer to that. Well, I mean, say, for example, that the original Body Snatchers movie was not a movie, but was actually an episode of the Twilight Zone, you know, if they found a way to adapt it to the half-hour format, it would have ended on the highway. You know, there wouldn't have been this bullshit the studio had forced in. The ending that was supposed to be in the movie, where Kevin McCarthy's just
That's another
running around
contender for my favorite scene, is when he's out on the highway screaming at everybody, "They're coming for you next!"
Yeah, because it's one of those great Twilight Zone sequences, you know.
I mean, that's like 50s trailer bait, but it's awesome.
It's like the moment from the end of To Serve Man when the woman runs up and says, "Don't get on the spaceship. To Serve Man's a cookbook." It's like that.
But it's also it's also like the thing from Another World.
Yeah,
where it's like, keep watching the skies, keep watching.
yeah. Or like Reefer Madness at the end, where they're like, "It could have happened to your kids or yours," and then they point to the screen, "Or maybe even yours."
Yep.
That sort of classic thing. We don't see that anymore. Somebody should do that. I think it would be very off-putting to audiences in the 21st century, and I think it would be fun. Yeah, so that's great. So yeah, the ending to the original, to the '78 version, definitely my favorite scene in that. Either that or the scene that you were talking about where Donald Sutherland falls asleep outside. The '50s version, I want to say the moment when shit really hits the fan, when they find the seed pods in the greenhouse, and they finally put two and two together what's going on. Now, I don't know why the seed pods were bursting open, since they weren't asleep in that scene. It seems to go against the way that it works in the rest of the movie. You know, that's one thing that the '78 version did differently. They waited and they had Donald Sutherland fall asleep, and then the seed pods started opening up. So you never feel that those characters are in any immediate danger, because they're still awake in the seed. They find the seed pods already bursting open for some reason. But it's such an iconic scene, because I think it's the first time we actually see the pods in the movie, and we see them before Kevin McCarthy does, so we know that there's something weird in the greenhouse, and you get that suspense thing going on, like, look behind you, there's something in there, and then they find them, and
we
they put
see
two and two together.
The pod person of his love interest prior to that, but we don't see the actual pod part of it. We just see like the weird body part of it. So, yeah,
right. Yeah. The greenhouse is the first time we actually see the pods themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very impactful scene, I think.
I agree. That's another contender.
So they figure everything out, and it's also when we get those wonderful life casts of the actors that I was talking about before.
Absolutely. But
interesting how each film basically had two contenders for what our favorite scenes were, and they were basically just the different versions of the same thing for each movie.
Well, yeah. Well, they both outline different approaches to similar ideas, and they reflect the time in which they were made in. I guess one thing we should also do, since we both have different perspectives on which one we think is better, what's your least favorite scene?
Another scene that's very well done in both versions is when Leonard Nimoy / the guy from the original movie comes into the room and explains the whole thing to the main characters. Least favorite scene in the movie. I mean, for the original, it's got to be that stupid tacked-on ending, right? Like, it kind of...
Yeah. That's a very strong contender. But I think for me...
It's just like what they did to the theatrical cut of Blade Runner, making them tack that fucking stupid happy ending on the end. It just undercuts everything that they had done before.
Right. That's totally fair. But I think for me, it's just everything with the kid. I thought that was just all really intolerable. If not only because that felt super 50s, you know, and it felt like if they would have just looked past, their own bullshit perceptions, they could have solved the problem more quickly. But I think part of that was also just the actor they got to play the kid was really annoying. And him running out in front of the car, almost getting run over, was dumb. That's another dumb thing from the 50s movie.
As far as least favorite scene from the remake, I'm trying to think. I don't think there were really any scenes in that movie that I sort of dislike.
I don't love the spa scene where it's like all the fat dude is getting out of the mud pit and all that.
Yeah, I think that scene is maybe a little too long. I like the setting. That mud spa is actually a really creepy location.
I think that's also somewhat of like social commentary for the time of like the gross place where we spread our disease and infections around, where we're also trying to socialize,
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, you could maybe cut out some of that stuff with her like giving the fat dude the massage and all that shit. But if there's one,
I just thought it was trying to be funny, and I didn't think it was funny.
Yeah, as weird and iconic as it is to the '70s version, and we've already talked about it. The part with the dog man hybrid is just so strange, and you have to really think about it for a minute to figure out what it was even supposed to be, and it's there to get her to scream, but you could have come up with any number of reasons for her to scream.
I totally agree, but it works. It works though. It's really creepy.
Yeah, I don't dislike it. Again, I don't think there's a scene in the movie that I like openly dislike. It's just really weird and raises some questions. So what
if it was a plantified person? Do you think that that would be just as bizarre, but it wouldn't need an explanation because that would be easier to put together in your own head as like, oh, it just the person wasn't fully formed.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I think maybe that would have been better. But it probably would have been a cheesier effect to pull off.
It comes right back around at the end.
Would have looked like fucking Swamp Thing, Wes Craven's Swamp Thing.
The scene swings right back around to awesome though when Donald Sutherland punches that woman.
like we said, there's a lot more violence, a lot more tactile, interpersonal stuff going on in the remake.
Another one of those little just background details that if you weren't paying attention would just go by you in the '70s version. There's a really creepy scene, and it's only creepy when you stop to think about it. I think it's near the end of the movie when Donald Sutherland is walking around and he's already a pod person, but I'm not sure. But you see some kids getting off of a school bus, and the teachers are clearly already pod people. And they're like, "Come inside, kids, it's nap time." And I'm like, "Oh shit."
Yes, that was really creepy. I agree.
There's also a similar moment in the original where the nurse is like, "Oh, I'll put the pod up next to the baby crib," and I'm like, Jesus.
Yep.
Which that's a question. If a pod imitates a human child, would it grow? Would it eventually reach full size, or would it just be a small pod person forever?
Yeah, I mean, we see that in the '70s version when Donald Sutherland's pod person starts out as a fetus and then grows into a full man before our eyes. But yeah, no, I don't know how it would work for a child. You'd think they would you'd almost want them to raise the human children, and then you would turn them into pod people later, so that way they can form their own memories, and then you can use those memories later.
Or let them grow to at least the size where they would be useful before you turn them into pod people. Because, again, maybe they do grow. I mean, they're plants, so maybe they do grow just like a normal human would. But if they don't, why would you make a pod baby? A pod baby would be completely useless to you. All it would do is lay around.
Can the pod people reproduce themselves?
I don't know. Also, they're plants, right? So I guess they photosynthesize. So all a pod baby would do is lie around and cry because that's all it remembers how to do, and it would just photosynthesize. That's all it would do.
Especially on a rainy day.
Yeah. So that's if it doesn't grow. Now, if it does grow, fine. If it doesn't, though, you would think that they would wait for it to get older and then turn it into a pod person. I don't know. It's another question. I wonder if any of these questions are discussed in the book, or if the book is just very surface level, like the '50s film is.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to read it and figure it out. That's something we should definitely talk about down the road, and see where all this started. Because I'd like to see which one gets at the idea at its core closer to what
Yeah,
whatever the original book was doing.
there's a long list of famous science fiction novels that got turned into movies that I've always wanted to read. That's on my list.
I've never read The
But
Thing, the book that read The Thing, the book that inspired The Thing, but I've been meaning to.
it's a short story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a novella, but I've always meant to, and I have never gotten around to it.
Mm.
But
I have an audio version of the story that Day the Earth Stood Still is based off of because it came on the Blu-ray, and I haven't listened to it in full. But
books are boring, so fuck it. No, not at all. I love them. But these two movies I also enjoyed almost equally. They both really do a good job of making the concept work in their own individual ways while also still, hitting the same notes that need to be hit. Dylan and I obviously both have our preferences. I prefer the 50s version because I think it gets it more at the, Red Scare element because of the setting. But the 70s version, again, definitely creepier and grosser in all the right ways. So
and such great ambiance.
absolutely, they're both they're tonally very different as well. Like you said, the 50s the 50s version isn't really a horror movie. It's a thriller. Yeah. It's a science fiction film in every sense of the word. It's a mystery. The 70s version, there's mystery elements, but it's not really a mystery itself. It's more of a horror movie. It's a psychological thriller. It's an emotional drama.
Yeah, they're very different in all those ways, but they're also very similar in other ways that I didn't think of. Like watching them back to back for this review, I realized how much closer the plots are to each other than I usually think.
Yeah, they're at a certain point they're kind of scene for scene, and I thought that was cool on the 70s version's part.
Yeah,
they're different at the start though. It takes a while to get to that point.
They have a lot of very interesting similarities and a lot of very interesting differences. But yeah, if you want the sort of creep factor and just the wonderful sort of atmosphere. Oh, and another thing I meant to mention about the 78 version is that it has a very interesting score that was actually done by, this is a weird story, the director's psychiatrist.
Wow, that is interesting given the Leonard Nimoy role and all that.
Yeah, the director's psychiatrist did the score for this movie because I guess they were friends and he did music on the side. He's like, hey, you want to do my score for my movie? So he did it, and it's really weird and it contributes to the atmosphere. And as far as I know, it's the only score this guy has ever done because he told the director afterwards that it was so stressful that he would never do it again. And then the director wanted him to do scores for more of his movies, but he would never do it. So it's a really weird
I remember
story.
really enjoying it and thinking it worked well in context, especially the end credits and how that kind of punches out.
Yeah, you can't say the same for the 50s movie, unfortunately. I found the music in the 50s film to be very generic.
I mean, it's a super generic 50s science fiction score. It sounds like the This Island Earth, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, anything like that, yeah.
I can't say for sure that it's stock music, but it sounds like stock music to me.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with you on that. I'm fine with that. I think it's part of the ambiance in and of itself. And I enjoy that. And I also think that it makes it kind of... it goes a little bit into... Even if you were in the theater in 56 and you'd never heard of the book, you'd be like, oh, well, this is probably about aliens because of the music.
Right.
I think that's good. I think that gives you a little key into the mystery if you're savvy and if you pay attention to pop culture tropes. So I think that's cool. So, like we've been saying, there's different approaches in both, but they both hit the same notes in the ways that matter. And I think that they're both definitely worth watching. You don't think that people should just totally ignore the 50s one and just go right to the 70s one, right? I think they're both worth looking at given the time period they're both made in.
I love both of these movies. Like I said, the edge that I give it the 70s version is by a very thin margin. A razor thin margin. They're so close to each other. in terms of overall quality. You know, there are qualities about each that's better than the other, or vice versa, or whatever. Uh, but I would definitely recommend checking out both. Just like I would recommend checking out both versions of The Thing, or both versions of The Fly. It's another one of those
Yeah,
situations.
without a doubt. It definitely ranks amongst those in terms of really good original and really good remake, both good for different reasons.
Yeah, it's a huge pick your poison scenario.
Sure.
I'd even throw
Who doesn't love to do that?
I'd even throw the first two versions of King Kong in that mix too. You know, pick your
Yeah,
poison,
sure.
33,
Sure.
30,
I'm
whatever.
not going to argue with you on that point either. That's a clearer choice for me, usually. Um,
Yeah, yeah. That's a weird one. I feel like I should.
it's a murkier one, especially
Yeah,
since there was another Kong movie in between. Anyway, two other ones.
yeah.
Anyway,
I imagine it's really murky for you because you didn't really like 76 that much until like very recently.
yeah,
You
that's
sort of
why
got
it's
turned on
murky.
to it.
Well, I think 76 is flawed despite how enjoyable it is.
Yeah.
Anyway,
For me, it's murky because I feel like I should probably find the 33 version like vastly superior, but I have all this nostalgia for the 76 one, and I can't really bring
right,
myself to.
it's just so enjoyable on its own. Yeah,
Yeah,
it has a lot of personality. Like the
yeah,
70s version of an Invasion of the Body Snatchers does, and like the 50s version does. I feel like they all have their own unique personalities that makes them worth watching. Like I like the cast of the 50s one, I like the cast of the 70s one, and I'll go back to both of them to see those different casts depending on what I'm in the mood for.
yeah, yeah.
I think that that goes a long way to making these movies
Also,
worth going back to and timeless.
also, if we get another remake of this in the future, can I please get like a crazy, disheveled old man Donald Sutherland running through a street shouting, "They're here! The
Yes.
end is nigh!"
Hell, if the original
If
guy's still alive, bring him back.
Hell yeah, if Kevin McCarthy put them both in there, that'd be great. I'd love to see those two
Have
like
them
running
fight
around.
each other to the death.
I'd love to see Donald Sutherland and like Kevin McCarthy, old ass Donald Sutherland probably be pushing him in a fucking wheelchair, but they're like going down the street like they're coming, they're already here. That'd be great.
Fucking accidentally
Or
lets
even,
go, goes rolling down a hill.
or you know what you could do? Donald Sutherland.
You have
We
to
know that he can
incorporate the
be a
Golden Gate Bridge into it somehow because it's the modern day.
right. You know what, Donald Sutherland actually, because we know that he can be sort of creepy, and he can be villainous, like he was the bad guy in those Hunger Games movies. You could actually make him the psychiatrist character if you wanted to. I think he'd be
Sure,
a good. I think he'd be a good Leonard Nimoy.
that might be cool. I would almost rather see. I would almost like to see Jeff Goldblum come back and play that character.
They're coming.
Blaming everything on marriage and fucking Donald Trump. Uh,
The pods find a way.
See, it's funny. I also watched They Live the same night that I rewatched the original, and I thought that was they make for interesting companion pieces.
The pod
Obviously,
people,
in They Live, the manipulation is a lot more psychological.
yeah. The pod people have taken my champion.
um, but yeah. So I don't know, D. What else did you want to explore about vegetables that go, hey, we can be people too, and we don't need to like each other about it.
Mm. Uh, so yeah, I mean, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the best remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers has got to be House and Garden from season 3 of Batman TAS, right? I mean, it's
After the 70s version, I think that is definitely the closest that they've come to nailing the themes. Um, but yeah, without a doubt,
also Cabbage Patch Kids, real cute
yeah,
until you think about it.
without a doubt. They should definitely bring it back to the plant thing. Like, bring it back to, space traveling, vegetable matter that, copies people and then produces people of their own that have the
Yeah.
memories without the emotion.
From what I understand, it's still space debris that causes the virus in the Nicole Kidman version.
But
They just took
they
out.
probably don't form their own bodies on their own. They probably take over the body that is already there.
probably a thing, like the virus replaces all of your DNA with its own, and then you become this other creature.
Which is why
Uh,
it's not the same. Which is a problem. That's the thing. Then like that's why it's problematic to make that an invasion of the body snatchers.
and then do you even have to go to sleep in that version? Like, what's the
Right.
deal? I don't know. I haven't seen that version myself, but I've heard
Maybe
things.
we'll do the '90s version and that one as a double feature down the line. But I would like to review the book first if we're gonna do that.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't seen the '90s version in a very long time, but I've also heard like
I've never
conflicting,
seen it.
and I've also heard like conflicting reports about whether people like it or don't. So I'm very interested to see how that holds up. I've never heard a good thing about the Nicole Kidman version though.
Me neither. But like I said, we're committed now. We're gonna do Invasion of the Body Snatcher Palooza, Palooza of the Body Snatchers. We'll do it.
Talking talking pods.
They're all perfect. Perfect. We'll do it gradually over time. Um, but yeah, no, I think we've certainly done some expansive discussions on that. I think we covered pretty much all the angles we could have potentially covered. I'm pretty
Yeah,
satisfied.
as per usual, I feel like that we covered everything, and then as soon as we hang up the call, I'll probably think of something else.
Right, right.
But I think the broad strokes have definitely been tackled here. Ultimately, what we have are two very good versions of a very interesting sci-fi concept.
Right, listen, just don't fall asleep in your fucking garden and everything will be fine. That's the point here. If we made that point, I think we're good, right?
I'd love to see like how like Doctor Who would tackle the body snatchers.
I mean, they've done stories like this a million fucking times, though. Every
Have they?
fucking episode of classic Doctor Who is, oh, this person's different, something's wrong.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've talked about this before. I feel like every science fiction movie is just an episode of Doctor Who that the Doctor never shows up in.
Yeah, I
Like,
totally agree, and I think that both of these feel that way.
so I
Um,
always thought it would be interesting to do like, I don't know, a comic or something where you just take established science fiction movies and just plop the Doctor in there just to see
yeah,
what happens.
I think that would be cool. I'd like to see the Doctor in like War of the Worlds, uh, any
The
number of
Doctor,
things.
the Doctor and They Live would be a fun one.
Yes, the Doctor in the Thing.
The Doctor in the Alligator People.
The Doctor versus Predator has been something I've wanted to see for a long time.
The Doctor in Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. That would also be awesome. Um,
You can team up with Raymond Burr.
but we're gonna be taking a break from Doctor Who and from strict, cold science fiction that takes place on Earth with like all that, you know, ideas about where our Earth-based society is gonna go. All those kind of ideas. And next week we're going to be going into a more fantasy direction. Dylan, should I announce what we're going to be discussing next week? Do you even remember?
Please do, because I am very curious.
Next week we're going to be going back to the realm of Star Wars, which is a franchise that I feel like we haven't discussed nearly enough of specifically on this show. The Last Jedi is quickly approaching us, and there appears to be some shenanigans going on with some Sith characters. So I thought what we would go back to and discuss is something that would be manageable for us to revisit in the time it would take to get a DFOS episode together. So we're going to do a comic book miniseries from the 90s. It's from a period of Star Wars that you and I both give a fuck about. It takes place directly after the completion of the Heir to the Empire trilogy, so it's prime, New Republic era, old school EU Star Wars lore, and it is the return of one of your favorite characters of all time in Star Wars to the fold, Emperor Palpatine. We're going to talk about Star Wars Dark Empire, one of the first
Ooh.
Dark Horse miniseries that was
Ooh,
ever
buddy.
produced. I think it was the first, actually, now that I'm thinking about it.
It very well may have been.
Kevin J. Anderson wrote the original script, and it was adapted into a comic book series. So we're going to talk about the comic book series next week. So
There Is there a novelized version of that one?
I
Or
think there might be, and I think that's what Kevin J. Anderson wrote because he didn't actually write the comic book version. He just wrote the story, but the comic book
right?
version is the one that, if there is a book, it came out after.
It's
The
confusing
comic
sometimes.
the comic is the iconic version of that story because there's also a comic for Heir to the Empire that Dark
right.
Horse did, but
I was about to say,
Heir to the
it's
Empire
confusing.
was definitely a book first.
Yeah, it's confusing like which ones were books first and which ones were comics first because there's all kinds of that shit in the old EU. You know,
Absolutely.
like all the use on Vong shit. I don't know if that started out as a comic
Oh
or
no,
a,
that
or
started out as books to be sure. Complicated and way too many books, but still books to be sure. And then it was adapted into comics. But we're gonna start with the comic version of Star Wars Dark Empire because that's where that story started and it's more iconic in that medium. And like I said, there's some connections to The Last Jedi and it's Star Wars stuff that you and I both really care about, so it'll be prime discussion material. So we're gonna talk about that next week. So and then we've got more sci-fi stuff planned after that. So it's a fucking barrage of science fiction, and we hope that you are enjoying it because we're not going to let up. It's all we fucking care about. Deal with it. We're demons from outer space after all, so maybe we'll do something demon-related in, like, December. That'll be befitting for Christmas, right?
Oh, yeah.
We'll do, like, Krampus or something. I don't know. Something
Welcome to the
demony.
welcome to the Christmas episode of DFOS. Today we're going to talk about
Today we're going to
fucking.
summon Satan.
Today we're going to talk about the fucking Exorcist stuff.
We'll bring back our Ghost Rider comic reviews, and that'll be our tribute to the Dark Lord.
I mean, we did the South Park Blood Orgy. Was that
Yeah,
last
we
Christmas?
did that last Christmas. We did the Ghostbusters literally busted the 3 ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future.
Yeah.
So we're breaking all kinds of Christmas traditions.
This year
That'll
for
be in the future.
This year for Christmas, Silent Night, Deadly Night.
We actually don't know what we're going to do for Christmas this year, but we'll figure it out. That's in the future, obviously. Next week, Star Wars Dark Empire. And then the week after that, we're going to throw ourselves off a cliff. We'll save that for the podcast finale. But until all of that in the future, I am Bill Worcester, a.k.a. Zazubaar.
And I'm Super DM624.
And it was a podcast, and that's why you couldn't see us. Colonel Hogan.